Hello everyone, my name is Tom. I am a tour guide at Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site, and today we are going on a virtual tour of America's most historic prison, from its unique beginnings, its gradual decline, and its eventual closure. So without further ado, let us begin. Eastern State Penitentiary opened in 1829 with the idea that through the use of solitary confinement or total isolation, people would become penitent, show sincere remorse for their crime, and eventually be rehabilitated. The prison was open from 1829 until 1971 and imprisoned over 80,000 people over the course of 142 years. This is an image of the historical marker outside of the prison today. Written in gold is a brief description of a summary of major events relating to the prison's role in history. Construction of Eastern State began in 1822 when the foundation was laid 2 miles outside the city of Philadelphia. Construction of the institution would take 13 years before being finished in 1836. Here is an early illustration of the prison dating back to this time period. The property covers 10.5 acres, so it is quite large, and resembles an English medieval castle. The outer walls of the facility are 30 feet high and constructed of a tan-brown stone. Arrow windows adorn the walls, which are topped with battlements. At the four corners of the property are massive stone towers. Overall, the prison has a rather Gothic and eerie appearance. Though the building looks formidable, this is primarily a scare tactic to turn people away from a life of crime by building the most intimidating building possible. While the exterior of the prison reflects an image of fear and intimidation, the interior drew inspiration from churches and monasteries of the time, creating a feeling of peace, quiet, and reflection for one's actions. Here we have a historical black and white photo from the turn of the century that shows these ideals. Pure white walls, natural light coming in through skylights, and barrel vaulted ceilings. We can also see that the cell doors are spaced about 6 feet apart. The floor is made of large stones. There is a small food cart and a guard standing off to the side. The corridor feels spacious and airy, much like an old cathedral. So who built Eastern State? What was the reasoning behind it? The penitentiary was commissioned by a group called the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons, which at the time featured several prominent figures. Pictured here are 3 of those individuals. They are older white gentlemen dressed in attire from the late 1700s. They all have clean-shaven faces and various lengths of gray-white hair. On the left, we have Benjamin Franklin, the famous founding father. In the center, we have Bishop William White, the Episcopalian minister to the Continental Congresses. And finally, on the right side, we have Dr. Benjamin Rush, a pioneer in the field of mental health. In the late 1700s, the organization met to discuss the future of prison reform in the United States. Up until this point, prisons across the world were known for their overcrowding, corruption, and squalid living conditions. Men, women, and children were often housed together in one room, awaiting an often incredibly brutal and humiliating punishment for their crimes. The Philadelphia Society observed many issues with prisons of the time and created an alternative approach to imprisonment. Taking inspiration from Quaker philosophy, the organization created the Pennsylvania system of incarceration, with the belief that everybody was inherently good and deserved a second chance. However, in the eyes of the organization, one of the largest problems with the old approach to prisons was social interaction. It was believed that by allowing desperate, but otherwise good people to interact with criminals in prison, they too would turn to a life of crime. Therefore, socialization was not allowed in the Pennsylvania system. Therefore, solitary confinement was the defining feature of Eastern State. This is a picture of a restored cell, displaying what an average 19th century cell looked like. It is a small room with a single bed with metal frame, a pillow, and gray blanket. At the foot of the bed is a small table with a bucket and a bowl. Against the wall on the left side is another small table with shoemaking tools on top. In the foreground, there is a basin or toilet. Eastern State Penitentiary was one of the first buildings to have indoor plumbing in the United States. The room is white with a wooden floor, high ceiling, and metal grated door at the back, leading outside. The room is small and oppressive, even claustrophobic. Prisoners would spend 23 hours a day inside their cells, 1 hour a day in a private exercise yard located at the back of the cell. Here is what one of the yards looks like today. The yard is a small open space surrounded by 4 walls and open to the sky. The ground is stone with some weeds growing out of it, and at the back is the metal grated door leading into the cell. Much like the cell, the yard is small and oppressive. In the 1800s, Eastern State would have been considered a minimum security prison, where the average sentence, or time spent in prison, was about 3 years. Most prisoners in this time period were sent to prison for a crime against property, such as theft, arson, and forgery. However, one of the most popular crimes was horse theft. Furthermore, one of the primary goals of Eastern State was also to help prisoners to return to society after their sentence was over. To achieve this, the prison implemented the use of a prisoner uniform to help conceal the identity of the prisoner. This is a picture of the prisoner uniform from the 1870s. The uniform consisted of a gray button-down shirt, dark pants, and most notably, a hood. The hood is made of a gray cloth, features 2 eye holes, but no mouth. Its plain appearance removes any identifying features. It is important to note that the hood was only used when a prisoner was being moved through the building, but not worn when the person was in their cell or their exercise yard. Another important part of Eastern State's plan for rehabilitation was the use of prison labor. In the 19th century, it was believed that prisoners should learn a trade skill to help support them once they left the prison. So the guards taught such skills as shoemaking, leatherworking, and furniture making. Here we have a black and white photo of a prisoner working on a construction of a chair. Much like before, the cell is small with white walls, and the prisoner is wearing a plain white shirt, dark pants, and does not have a hood. The clothes, however, do appear to be rather stiff. Interestingly, the cell does feature some decoration. A picture of a Bible quote is above the door, and 2 pictures of women dressed in formal dresses adorn the wall. The cell feels relatively peaceful and definitely quiet. Scenes such as these were pivotal to the reform of prisoners at Eastern State, as the work allowed for the prisoner to learn a new skill that could benefit them once they left the prison. The products the prisoners were working on would be sold to the public, in this particular case, furniture, and the money generated would come back to the prisoner to help them when they left the prison. The last major feature that was added to Eastern State was the use of what was referred to as the Radial Plan. This design meant that the prison was essentially a very large wagon wheel with 7 cell blocks radiating out from a central room. This design allowed for complete surveillance with a smaller staff. In this historical black and white photo from the 19th century, we can see the large central room from the perspective of a guard. The room is white, with a patterned white wooden floor. 3 doors are open, leading into cell blocks 3, 4, and 5, and a lone guard stands in the doorway of cell block 3. Much like the cell blocks, the walls and ceiling are white, which make the room very bright. When Eastern State and its Pennsylvania system were first put into use in this time period, the capacity of the prison was 250 people. At the turn of the 20th century, though, major changes came to Eastern State. Overcrowding had become a huge problem, and soon the use of solitary confinement could no longer work. In 1913, the prison officially abandoned the Pennsylvania system and switched to a new system called the Congregate System. Under the Congregate System, prisoners were no longer kept in isolation and were roomed 2 people per cell. They were trained in new fields of labor, such as machinery, shoemaking, and some prisoners even worked as members of the staff for the warden, the man in charge of the prison. In this black and white picture from the 20th century, 6 prisoners are working in a workshop. 5 of them are seated at a long wooden table in one of the many shops. This particular shop is shoemaking. 5 of the prisoners have their backs turned to the camera. They are wearing different colored vests, and some are wearing caps, some are not. One of the prisoners stands in the back and looks blankly at the camera. He has on a white apron over his vest. Also present in the picture is a single guard. His back is facing the camera, but we can see that he is wearing a black uniform with white cap and bars on his cuff. His shoes are also very neatly polished. I would say the atmosphere of this workshop is tense and kind of mundane. Another significant change that came to Eastern State was the crime that sent people to the penitentiary. As I mentioned before, the most common crimes in the 19th century were crimes against property, like theft. But in the 20th century, the most common crime was second-degree murder, which is murder during the course of another crime. The population of the penitentiary also grew quite dramatically in the 20th century, reaching its peak in 1934 when the population was 1,800 prisoners. The Congregate System brought with it many additional social changes to Eastern State as well. With the increase in population, the prison officials had to begin adding additional structures to the building, starting with cell blocks. Eastern State was originally built with 7 cell blocks, but by the 20th century, that number would be changed to 15 cell blocks. Many of these new cell blocks were built between the existing cell blocks from the 19th century. Furthermore, additional buildings like the kitchens, workshops, and industrial buildings were built as well. Many of them were converted from the 19th century exercise yards. Additionally, social changes came for prisoners to take advantage of during their downtime. Sports were the most prominent of these changes. Eastern State featured a variety of sports from basketball to handball, but one of the most popular was baseball. In this black and white picture from the 20th century, there is a baseball game in progress. The field is located between cell blocks 3 and 4. Cell block 3 is visible on the right side of the image. There are 6 prisoners present, and they are wearing baseball uniforms. The exterior wall is also present in the back of the image, which has some white benches running along the base. One negative aspect of the baseball field is that it was not regulation size, which meant that when someone got a home run, it was guaranteed to go over the wall and into the neighborhood that now surrounded the prison. In addition to support activities, there were many extracurricular activities at the penitentiary as well. Many prisoners took advantage of artistic endeavors, such as painting and music. There was even a prisoner band that would perform at special events and holidays. This is a black and white image from the 1890s of the library, which was located on the second floor of Center. The room is octagonal, with dark wood paneling on the ceiling and on the walls, and a dark wooden floor as well. The walls themselves are covered with tall bookshelves, which are also made of dark wood, and there are 5 freestanding bookshelves. The bookshelves are lined with volumes of books. In the center of the room is a dark wood table with 2 chairs, and on the left, a guard sits at an old ornate roll-top desk reading a book. The library offers us insight into another successful endeavor, education. One of the most successful opportunities for prisoners was continuing education. During the course of their sentence, many prisoners were able to receive high school and college education. There was even a prisoner who taught himself rocket science whilst incarcerated. Despite many of these more progressive policies at Eastern State, time began to catch up to the prison in the 1960s. The age of the building made it very expensive to maintain, as the prison was deteriorating faster than it could be repaired. Furthermore, there were many security breaches in the 20th century, mainly escape attempts, which brought the aging prison's security into question. In 1971, Pennsylvania and the city of Philadelphia shut down Eastern State after 142 years of operation. Prisoners were moved to other institutions in the area, and the front gate was shuttered. The prison was left abandoned for 20 years. In this picture, taken from the Central Guard Tower in 1986, we can see Eastern State as a stabilized ruin. The property is entirely overgrown with trees, some almost as tall as the outer wall. Some of the cell block roofs are visible above the forest of vegetation, even have bushes growing on them. At the back, the 30-foot outer wall is partially concealed by trees, and beyond the wall, houses from the surrounding neighborhood are visible. The prison truly looks forlorn. So why study Eastern State? How relevant is the prison, really? Well, as it turns out, very relevant. This image shows one of our more contemporary exhibits at Eastern State, the big graph. This is a 20-foot high bar graph, with each bar marking a specific decade from 1900 until 2010. The graph is primarily gray, but two bars on the graph are red, 1970 and 2010. The bar for 1970 is not particularly very high, but the bar for 2010 is very, very high. The purpose of this graph is to demonstrate the phenomenon of mass incarceration, which is almost exclusively present in the United States. Over the last 40 years, the U.S. has seen a huge boom in incarceration rates. There are currently 2.2 million people in the prison system today. To put this into perspective, the 1970 bar is marked red, which signifies when Eastern State was closed. At that time, the United States prison population included 300,000 people. But since then, the rate of incarceration has increased 600% over the last 40 years, which is why the bar for 2010 is also marked red. There are two primary causes of this problem. The first is the war on drugs, which was put into effect in the 1970s and 1980s to root out drug-related crimes. The second major cause was the passage of the Tough on Crime Bill, sometimes referred to as the Three Strikes You're Out law, which stated that if you committed 3 crimes, you had to do a mandatory set amount of time, often 10 plus years. The legislation in both of these examples demonstrates a huge focus on punishment for the crime, but leaves virtually no room for rehabilitation, even for the nonviolent offenses. Eastern State may have been closed by the time that these more contemporary issues had emerged, but the fact remains that many of these issues, whether it be overcrowding or the use of solitary confinement, they are still currently plaguing the U.S. prison system today, and they can find their origins in the prison's history. Therefore, it is imperative to study Eastern State's long and complex history to better educate ourselves in the complexities of the U.S. prison system. I want to thank you for joining me on this virtual tour, and I hope to see you in person on a future visit to Philadelphia. Have a good day.